Hello, Internet. Welcome to this show. Hopefully you're watching it live. My name is Bret. This is my channel. You may have been here before, but this is something I do live every week on Thursdays. So if you missed this live, come back on the next Thursday, 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern, GMT -6 or something like that. I forget. I think it's -4, actually. Anyway, the show here today is we're going to talk about service mesh, and we got a ton to get through. So I want to get through the announcements really quick. Hello to all you in chat. Thanks for being here. If you didn't know, this is supported by my Patreon members, and now we're announcing today that we also have YouTube memberships, which is basically the same thing. If you don't want to be on Patreon, but you want to support this community and all the open source, this podcast, the show, the YouTube videos, all that stuff, you can now also do it on YouTube. Clicking the little join button on the channel or in this video, and it's basically the same packages that I've been talking about on the membership platform Patreon. And a part of all of that, you get access to our Discord server, which is free. You can do that right above me, the Discord server for all things DevOps. I will also be bringing swag with me. I'm wearing swag to KubeCon, all about this DevOps community on Discord. I'm very excited about it because we've gotten a lot of people and a lot of stuff going on in there. Like, it's hard for me to even keep up with all the chat and the articles and everything that everyone's posting. So I really appreciate that. But the way to support all this stuff is now through one of those three means, either on Discord, by boosting the server, on Patreon, or on YouTube. A couple of bucks a month helps keep all this rolling. And also we have a loot store. So now you can get merch from some of my favorite designers that have agreed to work with me on DevOps topics. So we've got the new designs for KubeCon from Foxy. If you've taken any of my courses, you've probably seen Foxy before. She's the little mascot. And she's in her Kubernetes pirate outfit, which I love. So thanks, Luke Mai. Thanks, Ben. We got some other bare metal stuff in there. If you're 90s tech, if you're old enough to remember what SneakerNet was, we came up with this design a couple of months ago. I'm bringing it back because no one nowadays knows what SneakerNet is. In case you didn't know, that's back when we had to use USB sticks or CD-ROMs or floppies to move data around because it was faster than Ethernet. And so we'd call that SneakerNet. In case you want to check all that merch out, you can just go to, well, it's right below you here in YouTube or on this YouTube tab at the top. You can check out later. So what else? Well, I think that's it. Join the channel if you'd like to support me here on YouTube. But if you're already supporting me on Patreon, you don't need to do that here too. It's the same thing. It's just one other option in case people don't want to use Patreon. But enough about that. Let's get to my guests that I'm excited to be here with and get into the topics because we could talk for hours on this. So in the middle there, Sheriff Jackson on Twitter. We've got Nick Jackson, and he is not a sheriff, but today we're going to treat him like one. He's going to divide Lee and I got Lee on the end there, Lee Calcote from. Are you still in Austin?
Still in Austin.
Still in Austin.
Can't tell about my southern drawl here.
Yeah. And Nick's coming from over the pond. This is the second time this month we've had someone from London, and so I guess it's a theme lately. And I'm glad for us to get busy in this stuff. So let's just have you introduce yourself so people know where you're coming from. Lee on the end there, you're the one that I've known for 4 or 5 years as a Docker captain. You started Layer5. Tell me a little bit about that real quick.
Yeah, we started Layer5 about 2.5 years ago to focus on, helping people manage cloud native infrastructure, helping people expect more from their infrastructure. And so, we've been busy building an open source community and busy building a few different projects. 2 of them have landed into the CNCF a year or more ago. One of them we're going to talk a lot about.
That's actually pretty awesome. I didn't know that. I totally didn't know that. That's awesome. Yeah, it's great.
It went off and did that. So just about me briefly, we spent a lot of time getting to hang out with Bret in the Docker community. What a fantastic community. Spent a lot of time within CNCF land. Hard to distinguish the communities anymore. I'm a co-chair of one of the CNCF technical advisory groups, the one that focuses on network. We'll talk about service mesh a bit today. I'm co-authoring a book with Mr. Jackson, who's in between the two of us. And that's kind of my full-time focus is mostly open source work.
Nice. I'm putting the link for everyone in chat. A book on service mesh patterns, which is great. I love pattern books, by the way, because a lot of times just teaching the tool doesn't teach us the best ways to use the tool or the different options we have for using it. So patterns are my favorite. There in the middle, Nick, tell us, you got the HashiCorp shirt on, so you're burying the lead there a little bit, but you're from HashiCorp. Tell us about what you do.
Well, so I work at HashiCorp. I am a developer advocate. My background is software engineering, so I've been working in software engineering from about the time of SneakerNet. So, around about 25 years. And I worked in software engineering. I've worked from building the very first websites, then into distributed systems. I would say mostly kind of around e-commerce has been a kind of probably the thing. And then I decided that what I wanted to do was try and take the things that I knew and teach them to other people. And there's this role called developer advocacy, which basically allows you to do that, and which kind of I love. I get paid to be able to help people, and there's no greater reward than that. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. Docker, I've been using Docker since from I can't remember exactly what year it was, but if you can remember when it didn't used to work very well on the Mac. So maybe is that 7-8 years ago or something like that?
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, I mean it worked, don't get me wrong. But the core reason why I started using Docker was because I wanted a way to be able to run lightweight Linux applications on my Mac without having to use a full-blown VM. And when I came across Docker, I was just like, oh my word, this is the greatest thing in the world. And I still hold that opinion today. Wonderful, wonderful tool.
Yeah. And Lee and I have all those fond memories of being at the Docker cons when everything was new and shiny and the future was bright, and now we're like, oh, we're not done. I'm tired. We got all these new tools, which is why we're here today, to talk about more layers, more abstractions, which are becoming increasingly important. And Nick, are you involved with the open source of Layer5? What are you doing? Are you also a maintainer? I'm just trying to advocate for the fact that
I will,
maintainers are real people too.
Yeah, so Lee and I have known each other for a number of years. I forget how we first met. That's probably the most uncomfortable conversation you ever have to have with your wife. But we're not married, so that's fine. I forget. But ultimately, we've worked together, and predominantly service mesh has kind of been the key thing. I think we're both big believers in this as a technology, and I think from the rationale, we've experienced the problems firsthand that service mesh can solve. Yeah. And I think when you have that hindsight, it makes it very easy to and very clear to see the purpose of service mesh, which I think is actually really difficult for the wider community. When they look at it, they're just like, it's a new tech, it's a new buzzy thing, it's just people trying to sell me stuff. And that's not entirely true. So we met and we worked over that. Lee was launching Layer5, which obviously supports HashiCorp console, so we've been kind of helping around there. He's just a good buddy of mine as well, so we can spend hours on the phone just chatting, and we're writing a book with O'Reilly together, which is, oh gosh, it's been a challenge. It always seems to be. I spoke to somebody the other day about writing a book, and they said the best thing about writing the book is the day that it's done. And I was just like, oh my word, that is so true.
That is grim. That sounds so grim. But I will tell you that is the consensus of every, not just O'Reilly, like Manning, obviously. Any tech writer I know, they're like, yeah, don't quit your day job. And also, it takes forever. And yeah, I respect it. It's one of the things that I wish that I had the patience to do. And I just don't know if I will ever be able to do it. Like a blog post for me is super hard. So kudos to you for making it happen. I can see we're both, by the way, with our theme mugs. You have Layer5 mug, and I have my merch mug.
Oh, I need to go. Yeah. I need to go get one. Oh, I have to put a caveat in as well that I don't eat fish, like pretty much ever.
Okay.
I ate fish the other day, and I now have food poisoning. So if I look a little gray, or if I'm kind of like a little bit down, that's why it is. I'm actually not feeling my best. So I ask the viewers 100%. To apologize. I apologize humbly to the viewers, but blame the fish and don't eat fish, folks.
Well, you look great. So kudos to you for powering through. By the way, we are here to talk about multiple things, but we are going to get into service mesh. So those of you in chat, the reason we have this live is so you can ask questions along the way. So if you have service mesh questions, don't ask me. I don't know them. I don't know the answers to them. I've got two experts here to help you with that. But Layer5 has multiple projects. We could make multiple episodes about all the different things that you do. But I think the thing that we sort of led with, and at least in the marketing and talking to people about, was a theme for this year is Docker extensions. Like I've had 2 or 3 shows dedicated to Docker extensions already. It's the new hotness for Docker land and Docker desktop people. And now we have this Meshery component, which I am dumb about. I have not actually installed it yet, and I was excited for today's episode because you're going to teach me, and hopefully you're going to walk me a little through a little bit of it, because I want to be on the service mesh bandwagon, not as a fanboy, but as someone who, like you said, once you've implemented it and you understand the value it brings, that's how I kind of treat things like Argo and Ingress right now. So I'm hoping that by the end that I will understand more better, at least to more better. Listen to me with my English. I'll understand this a little bit better and feel like I have a solid understanding to always implement service mesh, or at least make that a part of my checklist for all future deployments, kind of thing. So what's the elevator pitch here on the Docker extension for Meshery?
Yeah. Well, by the way, this is probably the first phase of what that extension is. In the first phase, the elevator pitch is Meshery helping bring service mesh to your local development environment. Because for me, it's true. Like I'm using Docker Desktop every day. I'm using the Kubernetes instance inside of Docker Desktop every day. I have to admit, I need to go sign up for a subscription to Docker. Because I'm just, I've been writing the free thing for I can't believe I just said that on a publicly recorded, Anyway.
Well, you're always learning, and there's a free learning license. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, actually, geez, now that we're, so Docker is also quite generous to to Layer5's open source projects. So those projects are sponsored on Docker Hub, so there's no rate limiting happening with the projects that we're doing. Don't get me started on the singing the praises of Docker. Back to that value proposition is if you're working on, whether it's a Compose app or a Kubernetes native app, whether you're doing that in a Kubernetes manifest or a Helm chart, Meshery can import those apps, visualize them in your environment, let you configure those. It can deploy your service mesh of choice. So in this way, it complements Docker Desktop that brings Kubernetes. So Meshery can bring any service mesh that you would like. There's 10 different adapters for 10 different service meshes. And then with the flick of the switch, provision a service mesh. And ongoing help you manage the lifecycle of that service mesh and the workloads that you put on there. So Meshery often gets used as a learning tool. Most of the rest of us are still coming to understand what service meshes are and their and how to wield them and how to be confident in how you do that. That's part of why Nick and I are writing the Service Mesh Patterns book, is to, promote and suggest these templates that you probably want to start from.
And maybe I was going to say, maybe Lee as well, like it's useful because I'm just looking in the chat and there's a couple of folks who are saying like, hey, what kind of like, how does service mesh communication works? What is service mesh? Maybe it's useful to kind of just give a quick 101 to folks, because then they'll understand like, hey, why do I need to run service mesh in my developer environment? And I think that's kind of like a key thing, right? So why is the extension so important? And the reason is that one of the things that service mesh does is service mesh moves things like traditional reliability patterns, traditional observation patterns out of your core application code, and it moves them into a data plane or an externalized proxy. So previously, something simple like a retry, if you need to make an upstream call to another API service, you need to handle the fact that that might not work because the internet is just a bit flaky. And there's a whole kind of bunch of research on why it's flaky, and even Microsoft acknowledged that it's flaky. They even wrote a paper around gray failures in cloud environments, based on their own input. But it's just a lot of complex technology. So things like retries are incredibly important. You can never assume that something is going to work, and you can never assume that it's the upstream that's failing. Right, so retracking. So then you codify that retry and you say, well, hey, if it doesn't work, I'm going to retry it a couple of times, and I might want to back off like a couple of seconds, between tries. Now, with a service mesh, that thing which is codified alongside your application code, maybe using like a framework like Spring or MVC or something like that, it doesn't exist there anymore. It exists as an externalized piece of configuration. So it's actually the data plane, which is therefore doing the retries for you. Now, when it comes to observability as well, like basic network observability, how long a network request took, what the status code of it was, like how many bytes were transferred, what are the kind of, your typical P95, 99, 90 latency stuff. All of that as well, you're externalizing by using the service mesh as the kind of the source for that data. So when you're developing an application which is based on service mesh, you need to test those things. Like, it's incredibly important that if you're using a retry, you need to test the behavior of a retry as part of your application code. I cannot stress how important it is. And if you're externalizing that retry, well, then you need the tool which is managing the externalization of that retry, which kind of brings us all back to Meshery and being able to just use the Docker extension to be able to install your service mesh of choice super easy with a single click into your Docker-based Kubernetes environment, which just kind of makes everybody's life easy, right? And that's dev environments shouldn't be 300 steps to set them up and configure, because you just never get anything done.
Right. And the one of the questions I wanted to clear up front is because I think we had Alan asks, does Docker Swarm support Docker extensions? Is there a service mesh that can be used with Docker Swarm? And because I left the title of this show a little vague, and wanted to make sure we clarify up front that, because there is Docker, there's Compose, there's Swarm, there's Nomad, there's Kubernetes, there's ECS, there's all these different orchestrators or ways to run containers. And when we talk about service mesh, are we just talking about an implementation of service mesh for Kubernetes, or are there other orchestrators or container runtimes that can support a service mesh? I don't actually know.
Yeah. Well, so service mesh support is supported across a number of different runtimes. So, I mean, I'm speaking specifically for Consul. Consul will run on Kubernetes. It'll run on Nomad. You can run it as a first-class citizen in ECS, virtual machines, and you could make it work inside of Docker Swarm. I don't know if we have a sort of an out-of-the-box implementation around this, but in principle, which kind of, I suppose, answers another question around how the mesh communication works, is what happens is you have the data plane, and the data plane kind of sits in front of all of the traffic in and out of your application service. So Docker itself supports the concept of a sidecar, and generally this is kind of the way that the data plane will work. That the data plane's intercepting all of the traffic for your main application and acting as kind of like a gateway for ingress and egress, which is how it can do all of the reliability and all of the observability. So in order to make Service Mesh work with something like Docker Swarm, the reality is all you need to do is to inject an Envoy proxy sidecar alongside your main sort of application container, and just make sure it's configured up to the control plane, which is kind of like your thing, which is kind of managing all of the configuration.
Yeah.
So whether it does right now, I couldn't 100% say, but I would be sure as darn it that you could make it work quite
right,
quite easily. It would just be a matter of authoring the correct so I was reading a comment as I was writing. Authoring the correct configuration.
Yeah, and I think because a lot of these, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, Service Mesh to me seems like a series of technologies or features that are all independently deployable already. Like a lot of these things already existed before we had Service Mesh. The ideas of mutual TLS or the ideas of a separate network for your traffic or proxies on everything, proxies all the way down, kind of like turtles all the way down. And I feel like Service Mesh is really just a generic term for us bundling a bunch of these existing technologies that were even predating Docker, but we're bringing them together with this controller idea of an automated way of solving a lot of your data plane problems that distributed apps tend to have. Does that sound like anything close to what you're thinking of?
Yeah, I think it's pretty fair. I mean, ultimately, all Service Mesh is a software-defined network, and it just kind of pulls together all of the techniques that people have been using for years, and the kind of the patterns. But I think it amalgamates them into a piece of software which kind of does all of the heavy lifting and the management for you. I mean, it's a way that I look at like platform engineering at the moment. Platform engineering is like the latest, biggest thing in software engineering. Everybody is doing platform engineering. Like that shouldn't be a thing. People should just use a piece of software, which is a platform. And in some ways I look at like when you look at things like Pivotal Cloud, Foundry and PCF and stuff like that, and you look at where we are today, it feels like we've regressed a decade in the way that we're building applications and systems by re-engineering platforms ourselves. So
there's also that problem of sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but there's also that problem of a lot of us are also hobbyists. Like we got into this because we're passionate about technology, and then we want to play with things, and then eventually we justify the reason for needing to implement it, even though we really probably didn't need it to begin with. So I suffer from that too. Of did I really need to implement that? Could I have just done an easier way?
Well, I think curiosity is one of the greatest things that a software engineer can have, and I would take a curious software engineer who wants to play with all of the latest and greatest technologies any day of the week over somebody who just kind of wants to follow the trend, because you got to push the boundaries. And I think this is the key thing, I'm flippant about platform engineering, but the reason that people are doing it is because the technology doesn't really exist that's suitable and fit for purpose right now. And it was the same with Service Mesh and sort of the capability for doing the sort of the reliability and observability and security around distributed systems. I mean, you mentioned MTLS, but like just as a really sort of simple thing, just putting X509 certificates, even not MTLS, but even just TLS, to all of your endpoints and all of your services is no mean feat. And like even if you're using a tool like Vault or something like that, which will generate the certs for you, and it's still not an easy process. You've got to manage the rotation. You've got to kind of manage the private keys and the sort of the signing processes and things like that. It can be an incredibly challenging thing for people to do. So when you start to look at something like a Service Mesh, you get that for free. Like you don't even need to think about it. It just happens. So it's like if for nothing else that you're only using Service Mesh to be able to do TLS encryption on your network and mutual TLS identification between your service calls, then I think that's one of the big reasons to use it.
That's an interesting point too. So we're talking about a suite of features that any one of them might be hard for an individual to implement manually. I mean, we've all been around long enough in tech to know to be in that job where the TLS certificate, public one, expired and nobody knew about the rotation, and suddenly you're embarrassed because your main website gives people a warning and scares them. We've all been there, because this is a recent problem actually that we've basically solved with a lot of these technologies, and it required levels on the stack even just to automate that beyond the service mesh. So it is, for those that are still struggling with that, we have technically, I feel like, came up with enough solutions now. We're maybe a decade into sort of the let's encrypt auto TLS sort of approach, or at least even managed TLS approach of just managing the certificates and their renewals. And I feel like there's still people that are still doing it manually. And every once in a while I'll meet one of those people, and I feel sorry for them. So I'm like, hey, did you get the news? We solved this problem. You don't have to do that anymore.
It's difficult as well. And I think the core kind of premise around why. So, I mean, you look at TLS certificates and you could just say, well, hey, I'm just going to issue a 20-year certificate. And that's the way we used to do it. We would basically just choose a certificate, which was as long as you could possibly find. But the issue around that is that, well, if you're using a really long-lived certificate, like what if that leaks? Somebody can masquerade as your website or your application service. And TLS certificates are actually really difficult to revoke. I mean, TLS revocation lists, which is the kind of the mechanism to say that this certificate, although it hasn't expired, should no longer be considered safe.
Trusted. Yeah.
It's not an easy, it's not an easy process. So a much easier way to kind of do it is just to use short TTLs, short time to lives on your certificates. And then that way, sure, you can still use revocation lists, but if you're only using a time to live of 24 hours or something, and you've got a really good automatic rotation process, then that's the way to go. And a huge shout out to Let's Encrypt, because Let's Encrypt absolutely were blazing the way around being able to enable people in an automated way to secure the internet. And I think as an analogy, you can look at maybe Service Mesh, or the TLS part of Service Mesh, as Let's Encrypt, but for your internal services, because Let's Encrypt is obviously just publicly verifiable.
Right. And of course, this is just one, we're talking about one topic inside this world of service mesh. And being a sysadmin, having to run infrastructure for so many years, a lot of the features of service mesh to me are things that often would just get, like you were saying, would get opted out of a project because we didn't have the time or resources to even consider that, right? I always joke about monitoring, observability, what do you want to call it? That and documentation are the first things to get dropped from any new project. And I've seen it time and time again where budgets, we run over time, we run over budget. What can we drop from the project? Well, we don't necessarily have the best monitoring of observability, TLS automated renewal, like all the, especially automation, right? Automation, day two stuff. That's the stuff that kind of that falls off of projects because it's not required on day one. We will just deal with it later, and then we never do. And I love these ideas. I mean, this is the reason why we have containers today, because Docker solved a problem that was previously you could do it. You just had to be a guru and have a team of people. And now we all type a single command, and it all just magically happens. And
well, I mean, if you look at the concept of Docker, right? I mean, one of the kind of the major benefits of Docker from a security perspective is that you had. It wasn't that it wasn't possible to do immutable with your applications before Docker. It's just that it was really difficult. Now with Docker, because you've got this very narrowly scoped container which contains only the software in it you need, by default it is secure. Well, not by default, but it is more secure. And then in terms of when you think about the immutability, you need to update something. You don't patch it. You're not you're not layering different patches on and things like that. And things like that. You just replace the container. So when there was issues around Heartbleed and the other sort of SSL issues, which were affecting virtual machines, you weren't immune from that with your Docker containers, but it was certainly easier to kind of, to solve the problem. And I think like Service Mesh and all of the capabilities that it brings is in very much a similar vein. It's not, it's nothing that it's revolutionizing the world in what it can do. It just brings everything together and makes it a whole load easier for you. And to your point, it enables you to do the things that you should be doing, but you don't have time to do.
Yeah, and the Docker extension, like to do a lead in to Lee's demo, the Docker extension for Meshery is getting us even closer to that, right? Because so if people out there don't know extensions, let's just establish that up front. Extensions allow you to add plugins to Docker Desktop just like you would add extensions on VS Code or any other tool that has plugins or extensions. And these are all free, right? Like these are all included with Docker Desktop out of the box. There's a bunch of buttons in your desktop dashboard GUI. And I think Lee's going to give us a nice little demo of how easy this is to use and kind of hopefully give us some elevator pitches on some of the features. Because I, too, have been wanting to click the button to install it, but I knew we were having this show, and I wanted to be the noob today. I wanted to act like I had never seen it. So
you'll have a genuine response.
That's right. I don't have to fake it.
Yeah, I can't help myself but to add a little bit of flavor to what you guys were talking about, the purpose for service. Like Nick had said, hey, it's like SDN, like a next gen SDN that, you've got, there's a reason why you could have rolled your own Docker or a container orchestrator. But there's a couple of them out there that are pre-built, HashiCorp Nomad, Swarm, Kubernetes. You don't need to necessarily do that. And the same thing goes for, these concerns around distributed systems of the fact that these containers are speaking to one another, or they're speaking to external services, or they shouldn't be speaking to external services. There's just a collection of distributed systems concerns that you can address through a common layer. Like it's a layer that there's no doubt that all of us will get to at some point. All of us have gotten to, or the overwhelming majority of us have gotten to containers. And then we're successful with that. We get into some orchestration. We're successful with that. Things get more complex. We get into this next layer. That's in part what this Meshery extension is intended to do, is to help. Actually, Meshery was initially born out of this, out of helping people learn, out of answering the questions around what are they, how do they work, what's the difference, which one should I use. I can tell you that we're about to announce, with my CNCF hat on, we're about to announce that Istio is a CNCF project. It isn't today, but will become one. And that'll make for 5 service meshes just in the CNCF. There are a bunch of other ones external. And, there's a reason why, anyway. Let me not philosophize with you about why there are so many and what the differences that they do. Rather, let's do what Bret had said: introduce people to this extension so you can figure it out yourself. You can kind of play with them, answer that question yourself, and so all
right, let's do it.
Okay, if we're sharing here, so in this environment, let me uninstall Meshery real fast. So there's a list of extensions that, I guess actually I won't uninstall it because I think I'm running Meshery twice. So one of the nice things, by the way, as an artifact of Docker having created this extension marketplace, is that it's super easy to install a bunch of different types of software, including like Meshery. It's like the easiest way to install Meshery, and it won't let you mess up. So I was about to uninstall Meshery, and that was probably going to mess up by colliding with a couple other containers that I'm running. And so anyway, installing extensions are really easy. Most of you have probably done it. You can do it in Docker Desktop, or you can do it via CLI, Docker CLI. For Meshery as an extension, you'll come over, click to log in. You get presented a login screen so that you can keep track of the things that you're doing. One of the things that Meshery does is do performance testing. It's of concern to people who are trying to manage their service-to-service traffic, their service mesh traffic, how performant of an environment that is. They want to understand how to configure their settings on of like a circuit breaker, for example. And I am logging in. It's taking way longer than I thought it was going to take. I think this whole time I've been trying to prepare a demo to make it like for an interesting demo, and I've probably messed up my environment something impressive. But so to tell
Lee and
you
I can keep talking. Lee, Nick and I can keep talking about Meshery if you want to play with the demo a little bit, see if you can't figure it out.
Sounds good. I'll get it
because we actually haven't really talked about Meshery, and like maybe we can talk about it outside the scope of Docker Desktop's implementation of it. But Nick, can you run us through a couple of the things that I would use Meshery locally for?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of Lee touched on some of them. One of them is it allows you to kind of try and kind of poke around with different service meshes, because I think for the most part, service mesh I would say that the differentiator between a lot of the service meshes, it's predominantly the user experience. I mean, like ultimately they're all trying to do the same thing. It's all kind of like securing your connections with MTLS. It's your reliability patterns and your observability. There are various different sort of patterns of operation. I mean, if you look at, Liz was on, I guess Liz was talking about sort of isovalent and Cilium and things like that. And, Cilium kind of uses an eBPF based model, which does some stuff in the kernel, some stuff in the sidecar. Istio is kind of launched the ambient approach, which is kind of, again, a sort of a hybrid. My kind of current opinion is to the end user, that shouldn't really matter. It's more about the user experience and how you, I'm not putting aside the performance or the whatever of those sort of different capabilities, but it's the end user. Like you want to, what does the configuration look like? Is it easy to use? Like, is it understandable? And I think Meshery gives you the capability to kind of go through and investigate all of those things, because I would say that pretty much every service mesh that's on the market is going to be production ready. It's not everybody's going to be able to deliver you the observability, the security, the reliability that you need. Some different capabilities around testing different environments, multi-cluster, etc. And Meshery allows you to kind of do all of those things and just kind of kick the tires. And in addition to that, what Meshery allows you to do is there's the Meshmap, which is in beta. And what Meshmap does is it kind of gives you a visual configuration of how do you play around and configure a retry, because like I always look at I use the CLI a lot, and I'm really comfortable with that. There are people who aren't. There are folks who it's just not accessible to run 1,000 different commands to be able to get something to work. And whilst I wouldn't necessarily advocate ClickOps as a kind of a production methodology, it's great for experimentation, and then in some ways it can be faster. So Meshmap allows you to kind of, firstly, it allows you to visualize all of your services and your patterns. So whether you're doing ClickOps or not, that's incredible. You can see the connections that your service is making. You can see the reliability patterns that it is using, and all of those other things. And that's not just a local desktop level. You can run that as a production concern as well. But yeah, so like I think.
I thought I was on mute. Here I am clearing my throat for. I apologize. And now that I've interrupted, I was running like 3 different Kubernetes clusters locally, which is why the Docker extension was complaining that, hey, which cluster do you want to go into? And
so you don't recommend that? Is that what you're saying? 3 different clusters?
Well, or like pay attention if you're going to do that. I think I was trying to do too many things at once. I can share again if that's
all right. Let's do it.
Helpful to folks. So I installed the Meshery extension. You can, as you head into Meshery, there's a dashboard here. This one isn't like Meshery it's meant to be more than a service mesh manager. So it's a cloud native manager. It'll connect to Prometheus and Grafana and show you a lot of statistics about what's going on. If you've got Grafana charts, it'll import those and help you take advantage of the investment that you already have there. It'll, depending upon whether or not you connect up different Meshery adapters to different service meshes, Meshery will go quite deep on each of these meshes. It'll also, it's a multi-mesh or multi-Kubernetes cluster manager. So it will deploy the Meshery operator to each cluster that you connect to. It'll run mesh sync. There's a lot of portmanteaus in the naming of our products, or the projects. It'll run mesh sync. It'll discover your existing environment, so you can use Meshery to provision service meshes or discover them. The reality is, there's a lot to be done with Meshery without running a service mesh. You can import different applications, whether that's a Docker Compose app, and bring that into Kubernetes, Helm charts, your Kubernetes manifests. You can create your own designs as well. So the patterns that Nick and I are writing about in the Service Mesh Patterns book, you can use this design configurator to let's say that you want to configure console service mesh, and you want to take advantage of the fact that there's a service splitter, and you can come through here and you can configure it, visually like this, and kind of fill in how you want it configured, and you'll see the YAML being built out for that configuration here. You can take and deploy those designs, sort of touching your YAML if you want, to what each of you, to what you guys were just talking about is Meshmap, and it allows you to still touch the YAML if you want to. As a matter of fact, it's Git integrated, so it'll integrate into your GitOps pipeline. There's 2 GitHub actions out there.
I didn't know that. So have you made ClickOps, GitOps?
Yeah, that's part of the...
I'm serious, like that. That's sick. I didn't know that feature was there. That must be new.
Yeah, it is. And it's still, we were just having a chat with LinkedIn SRE this morning about, and he kind of had the same reaction, which was nice. Which also says, hey, maybe we should talk about that on a website somewhere or something.
Hey, Lee, while you're at it, can you widen your screen a little bit? I think it'll help the app. There, perfect. Yeah, that's great.
Nice. Just as a kind of a segue, I think Kelsey Hightower a couple of years ago was kind of joking around with the whole no code thing. Mm-hmm. But Kelsey Hightower doesn't, he's not just playing the fool. He has he's having some fun, but he's got a very real kind of premise to what he's talking about there, and ultimately it's a real thing. Like, some people just don't want to, don't have the skills to be able to kind of to do editing YAML files or whatever. So being able to have a visual designer which can follow the same patterns and practices, which gives you the kind of the Git flow approach of being able to do merging, code reviewing, and revisions and reversions and things like that is super cool. Like that enables a huge spectrum of users in your system. I'm stoked. That's dope, Lee.
Yeah, there's a lot of So the nice thing is there's a lot of open source contributors that come by, get involved. The vast majority of them say, "Hey, so what's a service mesh?" And some of them really get into that, but a lot of them maybe stop at Kubernetes, or a lot of the contributors come by and they don't know Kubernetes either, but they do know that they'd like to understand it better, and that seeing it visually and having context for what's really going on is eye-opening. There is like so much to say about the features within this project. I am almost one of the worst at like trying to tell people this. There's like, if you're doing a design and you're trying to adhere to one of the service mesh patterns, or just whether it's a service mesh or not, you can import them in here, can kind of verify your design, like validate it. Does it have issues where maybe you didn't specify, the Docker image that you're supposed to use? Well, then you'll end up with a validation issue. And so before you deploy, it wants to make sure that you're successful. You can, deploy these designs to one or more clusters. And
for those, sorry to interrupt. I was going to say for those that are just joining us, what we're looking at is the Docker dashboard in Docker Desktop, and you've installed Meshery extension, and inside there you have installed a service mesh, right?
Yeah.
It automatically does it, or do you pick one?
Yeah, you pick one, and so let me see if I can. Okay, yeah. Sorry, for a second I thought we were going to have an issue, but yeah, you can pick one. So this is the main page of that Docker extension for Meshery, and it just makes it a single click action to get up and going with any of the service meshes here. I'll pick arguably my favorite service mesh maybe, and it will, deploy. In this case, it'll just deploy it with a default configuration. Maybe that's great for the environment that you're working within, or maybe you want to, have it replicate what's in production. You then, subsequently go into Meshery itself, and there's a couple of different ways to, manage the life cycle of any of these service meshes. The one that's the most compelling, and to what Nick was saying about just level of comprehension and understanding of what's going on, is this this visual designer for dragging and dropping. Let me get to. You can go to your mesh of choice, go to the version of choice you want to work with, bring in those components, connect them up. Ultimately, there'll be workflow and policy that you can configure. Bit of the GitOps integration that we were just referring to, and what else am I missing? There's a catalog of extensions coming forth. Or rather, the designs that you do, you're welcome to download them, export them, share them in the Meshery catalog. The Meshery catalog's on the Meshery.io website, so it's like Meshery.io/catalog. And you see some people have started to share some of their designs. Those could be WebAssembly filters. They could, in the future, those could be eBPF programs. Meshery doesn't support those yet. But yeah, it's intended to be, you got to start and focus on service mesh. But it is usable if you only have Kubernetes. As a matter of fact, it's usable if you don't have Kubernetes. We haven't really talked about Meshery's performance management capabilities, which is to say that you can do load generation and test out the performance of your environment by using one of Meshery's internal load generators. And
that's super important as well. I mean, anybody who runs a production system should be doing performance and load testing around. It's also something that's quite difficult to set up, and the reproducibility of those tests can be a challenge to manage. So that's pretty sick to have that built in there.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, with the people I work, I work with 3 or 4 different clients a year, and I have yet to have one actually implement performance testing as a part of their, what you want to call it, your CI/CD workflow, or what, they certainly don't have it automated. If they ever do it, it's a manual effort. It's someone's job for like a month, and then they usually come away with notes, right? Like, we need to improve this, this, and this, and then they don't. And then there's no more testing because the testing is so arduous. It just doesn't happen very often, and it's a special, unique event. The more I didn't actually know this was the thing in here in terms of like having a GUI as well that will help me along the way, because performance testing is an art, right? And it's an art that a lot of developers don't get to. It's not mandated that they test their own stuff for performance, as long as, like, I think there's that saying, you don't have a performance problem until you have a performance problem. And so, we all write software, it's sufficient enough, everyone's happy, and then suddenly one day we have a problem and we have no idea how to troubleshoot it because we've never had to. We've never had to at least do benchmarking or, any of that sort of stuff. And it's if you're building more than a simple website, it can, like you're saying, it can get pretty complicated pretty quick. So this is neat.
And I mean, like, it doesn't, and I think it doesn't make sense to over optimize. I mean, if your average requests is, say, 100,000, it really doesn't make sense to build a system that'll support 10 million, because the complexity involved in doing so is exponentially larger than what it is to kind of support. You've got you start running into things like, well, one layer of caching is not good enough anymore. I've got to use multiple layers of caching. I've got to use localized in-memory caching. I've got to use something like Redis maybe, or Memcache is on a kind of like a cluster level. And then, like, I've got my database as well, and maybe multiple databases because I'm doing mirroring. So, like, all of those problems kind of manifest themselves with scale. But it's super important because, like, I don't know if Black Friday is still a thing, right?
Yep. Cyber Monday, Black Friday. Yeah, so we gotta.
I used to work in e-commerce.
Yeah, we're gonna have that exception day. Yeah.
Yeah, and we used to do Black Friday testing, and I guarantee you, over the course of the year, the system would work perfectly. We'd start to do the Black Friday testing about a month before, and the system we knew would not be able to hit the load. And then you would end up spending basically a month going around cleaning up code and kind of going through and kind of making performance modifications and stuff like that, and trying to find the previous year's tests, the previous year's information, to be able to do a compare and comparison to kind of look at where things are always very similar. And it was just really difficult. And should we have done that as an ongoing process? Yes. Did we? Well, no, because we were just constantly under the pressure to kind of like, and the tooling just wasn't there. There was no tooling to be able to easily do it. So, like, this stuff's dope.
So, all right, let's recap. Install the Meshery extension for Docker Desktop. Now, you have to have, do you have to have Kubernetes enabled in order to use it?
You don't. That's boy. Yeah, that was the. You'll want to. No, you don't. That's a great question. That's actually what I was trying to say about the performance testing that it will do. You can install Meshery without Kubernetes, and you can run those performance tests, as many as you want to, against services that aren't on Kubernetes and services that aren't running in context of a service mesh. Mm-hmm. And then from there, if you want to do, if you want to manage clusters and things, then you start to install and connect up whether you're, connecting it to your local Kubernetes environment or to a remote one. Meshery helps. It connects to, we haven't done scalability testing on Meshery to see how many clusters it could potentially take at a time.
You could maybe use Meshery to do scalability testing on Meshery.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, we're coming close to the end of the hour, so I'm going to throw it out there to the people in chat. If you haven't got your questions answered, put them back in chat. Sorry if I missed one or two of them. I tried to get them all. I think that if you're new to Service Mesh, it sounds like Meshery is the right way to go because it allows you to explore, learn, play around, and not have to invest 5 hours into just how to install each one of them. I love the toggle of just like I'm just turning on, Traffic Mesh. I'm just turning on Istio. And I want to mention some other stuff because these two gentlemen are they're all over the place. Like basically, there's a lot going on. They've got a book. We showed off the book. They've got the Meshery thing. They've got the other Layer 5 tools. They've got Meshmap, which is in beta, which is a part you can get that in Meshery, right? Like once you turn on Meshery for Docker Desktop, you can get that out of the box. Go to their website for their community stuff, because I know that it sounds like there's a solid growing community behind this with so many people investing in your open source, which is great. That's a really good sign of a healthy, open source ecosystem there. Nick's got other stuff that I just wanted to hammer out, because we actually have fans in chat. Who knew that you were bringing your fan club with you? But Nick over on his channel on YouTube, which if you scroll up in chat, or just, I think it's like just 2 posts ago, you can check out his microservices channel on YouTube. Sounds like he's helping solve some people's problems there. And then there's this other project, which I feel like it should just be its own show, and we need to have you come back. But which is not directly related to Meshery, is Shipyard. So what's the elevator pitch really quick on this thing?
So basically it was running local demo stacks. So you need to install Kubernetes, you need to install Prometheus, Grafana, and a bunch of application stuff. And, well, there's also generally a bunch of configuration that you need to do around there as well. You need to generate TLS certificates, or you need to do stuff. So I kind of look at it as Docker Compose on steroids from some aspect, or if anybody's familiar with Terraform, if Docker Compose and Terraform had a child, Shipyard would be that child, because the project is directly, I make no sort of, I basically stole the best ideas out of both of those and try to merge those together. So you've got the capability in Shipyard that everything is dependency related. So you can spin up one container before you spin up another. You can execute a bash script or something to do some things before you maybe spin up a container, or you can spin up a database. You can provision the data into it, and then you may sort of spin up your application. So like some of those things which are possible with Docker Compose, but you end up doing like a bunch of dirty hacks with bash scripts and stuff like that. Shipyard just tries to make that easier and distributable as well. I mean, you've got, if you want to run a kube cluster or a Nomad cluster or something, it's just a simple abstraction. So it's something that I use for all my demos. It's something that I wrote specifically for that. And it's not really something that I've ever shared, because even though I use it every day and maintain it as well, just I've never had the time because of all of the other things going on. So this is probably one of the first times I've actually ever talked about this publicly.
I think, the fact that you do a lot of demos, that's dev for life. We could probably have an entire show, because we're all getting back into conferences now. So those of us that do demos for a living are now having to actually do them on stage again, which is all new. But I recently just did some work on my CLI, because you spend so much time demoing from the command line. And I'm looking at this screen, and it's reminding me that I have kind of revamped. For those in chat, I have not necessarily to mention it, but there is basically how I configure my shell. Because if you do demos on stage, if you do demos in a course, which, with so many students in my courses, people have watched the same videos over and over. And early on, I made the mistake of making my shell really fancy, and people get distracted on exactly how, like, they're looking at all the stuff that you're doing, and you're like, wait, how's that command completion working? Wait, where's his colors coming from? Is that true color? Oh, he's got italics in Vim.
That stuff makes a huge difference.
It does, but people get distracted, right? So I've learned, like, you're just reminding me of, like, you want a little bit of magic in your demos. You don't want to take all the work, put all this work into it. But at the same time, I've learned to simplify down. So I've always had some sort of mechanism to get a present shell, where I just type a command as alias to something else, and it basically dumbs everything down in my console. So it sounds like I need to invest into Shipyard for deploying and setting up my demos, so that I don't have to spend so much time. And then if you just a shameless plug here, if you check out my shell URL here, I get so many questions from it, like, hey, how did you get it to look like that or do that thing? And those of us that have spent 20 years in a shell, 30 years in a shell, it's a lot. There's a lot going on usually if you're someone who gets into this stuff. So I have lots of links, including custom prompts that you can make to dumb your own shell down. If you want the Docker logo or the Kubernetes logo in your shell prompt, like we can do all that. So anyway, it reminded me of that because one, this little demo is beautiful, and it looks like you're using Starship right in there, which we talk about.
Yeah, I use that.
I think we've mentioned it several times on this show recently because people ask a lot, like, "Ooh, how'd you get all that cool stuff in your shell?" Starship, it's pretty great.
Yeah,
you should check it out. Built-in
100%.
Rust. So we've been all over the board this hour, but that's kind of the way it goes, right? All of us are doing so many things. So everyone get the links below to the book that they're working on. It's not released yet, or what's the status of the book?
Oh gosh, that's a thing.
Pre-release?
Did you just hear our editors rolling their eyes? Like
they're in the chat right now.
Yeah,
I hope not. It's been a bit of a. I mean, I'm joking, but it's been a. When we started doing things, it was kind of pre-COVID. And everything was kind of, it was perfect. There was no problems anywhere. And then kind of just COVID hit and just like, it's just been so difficult. And now things are, Lee's business is obviously really ramping up. I'm pretty busy back in conference season. We really don't have that much more to do. And it's just kind of trying to get things over the final hurdle. But
yeah,
like my approach on this is that I'd rather do it right than do it fast. I mean, less of a, and I know that's probably not what O'Reilly wants to hear, and I don't mean that, but what I mean is that if my head's not right in it, I'm not going to write as well as I can. So we hope that we'll be finished our draft by the end of this year, and that we'll be kind of looking at publishing sometime next year.
All right.
But,
are there like
that's
sections?
Like
are there like early
missions.
access sections or anything?
Yeah,
like that?
There's a couple of early access chapters on O'Reilly.com, and you can kind of read through there. We've got some, I think, canary deployments. We've got retries. So like what we're trying to do with the book is where, like you look at a retry and you're just like, hey, a retry is just super simple, right? I mean, I think the key thing around this is unless you really understand the pattern, like when people sort of describe a retry, they very much describe as sort of the high level function, which is if something doesn't work, retry it.
Right.
The nuances around the pattern are not necessarily so well described. So if you're brand new to something, then you sort of might not think about these things. You might not think about, well, actually a retry could be detrimental. Like how do you test a retry? What is an appropriate number of retries? How do you kind of like calculate?
Is it more than a for each loop times 5?
Yeah, just ever so slightly. Yeah, like idempotency and things like that. Should you retry post requests? Well, like,
if you're,
I mean, I think it depends, right? And I think all of these things, and I'm using retry as an example. We cover a lot of the patterns. We look at them how they're very specific to service mesh. So we're looking at the depth of MTLS and things like that, how it actually functions. The various different patterns around how a service mesh operates, because it's important to understand from a mechanical sympathy how your system works, because when you need to debug it, like you need to understand where the traffic's flowing from and potentially what could go wrong and where. It's been a really enjoyable process. I mean, this is my second book, so I should have learned my lesson from the first time. Lee's on to I think it's your 30 or 4th or something, so you really should have learned. So you're really looking at two people who don't understand how to learn a lesson. I'm
still married too, which is that's the unbelievable part.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a saying I like to say, like if you want to learn something, teach it. Like that'll force you to really learn it, because I think a lot of us, we don't want to look dumb. So then we overcompensate by learning every possible thing before we teach it. And I definitely am that way, where I hesitate to talk about a topic that I don't know really in depth, and I always feel insecure. Imposter syndrome is real, and we've all probably got a little bit of it. So
shout out to you there, Bret. I mean, but realistically, when people are looking at a lot of online courses and online materials, and they're like, oh, this is good stuff. I don't think they truly appreciate just how much hard work goes in behind the scenes, because to your point there, you're going through stuff and you're going, well, I know how to do this. why does this actually do this? Like, why does this work? I've kind of forgotten this along the line. So the effort that you have to put in to be able to kind of look into all of those tiny little details and to be able to kind of tease them out and to be able to put them in a way that's understandable. And the easiest way to do that is to be able to do it so that you can yourself understand it, is a huge amount of effort. So like, kudos to you for doing that with your courses and your materials. And,
and thank you for the book. Like, it sounds like you're doing that in the book. So, and this all comes out in your work, right? Like you're implementing a feature in Service Mesh, Meshery, Meshmap, all the things. And it's, what is there saying? Like, how you do one thing is how you do all things. So if you're someone who's detail oriented and you dive deep in just writing some chapters of a book, you're probably doing the same thing in your daily job. You're probably doing the same thing in your software code. And I really appreciate that sort of thoughtful approach to coding. I mean, we're now in a world where we are not lacking for tools. It is a question of which tool works for you, and which one is really thoughtful and approaches these things in a more holistic way. And it sounds like you guys are doing that. And congrats, by the way, to Lee, like you mentioned, in Layer5 for growing that company. And I did not realize all the things that were happening. So that's really cool. And I'm definitely going to spend some more time looking into it.
Fantastic community as well. Like, so, big shout out to the Layer5 community. There's some absolutely wonderful, wonderful people. Some of the nicest people that you will meet in technology. So get on the Layer5 Slack. If you're looking for a project, a CNCF project, and you want to start contributing and start, learning something, raise your profile maybe, get into Meshery. Folk are so helpful, so happy to help you and get you onboarded, and you'll learn a bunch as well as learning from people and stuff like that. So wonderful community.
To both of your points, actually, some of that learning, co-learning is a bit selfish, because every other person in the community that's trying to help the other person, they are inevitably just start learning together. It has been, it's almost killed me. I'm trying to help make sure that those that join understand, like, hey, the culture here is what Bret said. We all have imposter syndrome. I learn something new every day. I just learned that, like, hey, maybe I shouldn't be running 3, different Kubernetes clusters and try to give a demo where, and so, but yeah, one of the things that, I'm fortunate to be able to help represent a lot of the work that, like, there's 300 people who've made the Layer5.io website, just that website. So that's awesome. Much less like Meshery, and it's open source through and through. People come by, and as it turns out, we do lots of internships. One of the internships that we do for Meshery, it's the #1 most popular internship for the Linux Foundation. Not just the CNCF, I mean, for the entire Linux Foundation, which is, which I think speaks volumes to wanting to learn together. So, come jump in.
Well, thank you again, both of you, for being here. All this stuff can get at layer5.io, right? Like that's like the main way to lead into all this stuff. The book, the Docker extension plugin, or you can just go in your Docker desktop right now and add the extension and get started. And I'm looking forward to doing that myself. So thanks again. For those of you, we are here every Thursday. If you're new to this, and this show itself will come out in a podcast. The podcast link is below. Of course, we talked about their book is below. My course links for coupons are below. The Discord community I run, the community that they run, all the links are in the description. So find all that stuff down there. Next week, I'm actually going to have, let's see, what do we got coming up? We've actually got a lot going on, and future shows. Oh, we're actually having HashiCorp back on next week. Rosemary Wang is here. I'm not sure if Nick knew about that. So Rosemary's coming back, and we're going to talk about Vault, probably some other things. We're going to get more into HashiCorp projects. We've had her on before, and it was a hit. So we HashiCorp makes a lot of stuff. So we had very little time in an hour to cover things. We talked about console a lot. And then Brian Christner's back from he runs at jackpots.ch. He's actually like the CTO of an online gaming site, and we're going to be talking about simplifying things, keeping it simple. And then we've got the founders of the Chain Guard project on. I'm going to be at KubeCon, so we're probably going to do something at KubeCon. We've got Anais from Aqua Security on next month. So please come back on Thursdays. Check out the podcast, all the other stuff, and we'll see you next time on YouTube Live. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks all.